Hi, Philippe.
Hi, Clément.
It's great to have you back for this third episode of The Economic Perspective. Today, we're going to dive into a topic that's quite compelling, the rise of public debt around the world and what it signifies. With the IMF recently stating that global public debt could reach 100% of GDP by 2029, a level we've never seen before, what does this really mean? What critical issues does it raise for our economies? To start, could you give us an overview of the current state of global public debt and what such a level generally implies?
Well, the best way is to look at what has happened on public debt for a century. What we saw is that public debt has increased as percentage of GDP, has increased during conflict, during World War I, World War II, and during the Great Depression in the 30s in the US. That's what we have seen for centuries. Aristotle spoke about that in the Economics a long time ago. What is specific at this moment is what happened after the first oil shock between 1925 and 1980. At this moment, everywhere, the public debt as percentage of GDP was at its lowest level. And since this moment, it has increased dramatically. Without war, that's the question. What has happened in the economic model to have this trend? And if we look at France, for example, from the bottom in 1975 to 2025, we see a kind of linear evolution. It's a straight line. And so it means something. It means we are not in a conflict, we are not in war. What has happened? That's what we will discuss now.
Specifically, what impact is this increase in global public debt having, or could it have, on overall economic stability? What scenarios should we consider if this trend continues?
The first point is to say, when your debt is high, the capability to react to an adverse shock is lower than when you have no debt. That's a question. When debt was at 20% of GDP, when you have a shock, it's easy to react. When it's 15% of GDP, as it is the case in France now, the capability to react, the capacity to absorb the shock is more limited. What would happen in France now if we had a new pandemic? It was easy to react in 2020. How is it possible now? How would it be possible now? That's the first question. The second question is in terms of sustainability. When you have a very low level of debt, it's easy to make this debt sustainable. When debt is high, you need to have a strong growth to limit the way the debt is increasing. So that's the second point. And the third point is that what we see and what the IMF has noticed is that many countries are now in a situation with higher public debt. But the risk is not the same. France, US, Canada, South Africa or Rwanda have not the same type of risk. So investors will react differently depending on this level of risk. And that's a real question now, and probably it could lead to a brutal adjustment and something that will create a kind of discontinuity in certain countries.
Looking at the current dynamics, what are the underlying causes of this surge in debt? Is it merely a sign of a shift in economic models or debilitating productivity issues? Or does it also indicate that aging economies, particularly in Europe, are struggling to adapt to new realities? What about France in particular?
Well, the question is, what has driven the debt since the first oil shock, as I mentioned? We see that in almost every advanced country, in US, in UK, in France. What does it mean? It's simple. It says that the social model needs a higher growth than what the economy can product. You know, we've done some calculus for France. At the moment, the social model needs 3% growth every year to stabilize. The economy was not able to produce more than 2%. The discrepancy, the deviation between the two is the growth of public debt. We've seen this kind of situation almost everywhere. And Germany is the exception due to probably to the large consensus we have in Germany on public debt. That's very different and very specific. Since the pandemic, we have seen many new elements that came. Well, we have the strong growth of public debt during the pandemic. It has consequences on the level of public debt, on the level of interest we paid every year on that debt. Now that interest rates are higher. That's the first point. The second point is that after the pandemic, the situation, the way we manage the environment has changed. We said, okay, we were in a globalization area. We now have local problems, and we need to solve this problem locally. So we will have strong industrial policies. That's what we've seen in China. That's what we saw in the US with the Inflation Reduction Act or the tariff. Come here and produce with me, and I will subsidize your investment. So that's also an important issue. The third point is that now, and that's why the IMF said we will have an increase in public debt in coming years, because we have some kind of new expenditures. Population is aging. We need to pay pensions. The climate transition is at cost. Decarbonation is at cost. And we spend, specifically in Europe, more capital on military expenditures. So we will have to we will have to make trade-off between all these expenditures. But in the short term, we will try to spend everything. So that's the point we have. And so we are in a situation where we consider that the adjustment goes through public debt. And one element is that in that environment, global growth is not that strong. So we are in a situation where the capacity to limit debt increase is limited because receipts for government are not that high. And so the arbitrage is very complicated at this moment. We need to spend more for the social model, for aging population. We need to spend more for climate, for defense. We don't want to change this situation because the environment has changed. We need, the geopolitics has changed, so we need to spend more on guns, etc., planes. And at the same time, growth is lower than what we saw in the past. And this is specific to Europe. And so how will we be able to manage that? That's a real question now, and that's something that could fear us.
Lastly, is the rise in public debt also not a sign of the competition for economic leadership among major powers?
Clearly, that's the case between China and the US. They said we have to be strong competitors on technology, so we spend a lot now, and it will be better in the future. So that's the point, and it will help us to be stronger and to be more competitive if we are the US with China, etc. This is not the case for Europe. Europe is almost in the background of that because we are not able to compete on technology with China and US. And so we have to spend a lot to innovate and to try to limit our discrepancies with these two countries. So it's very different from where we see the thing. China, US, and Europe is a little in the back of this competition. And other countries are also in the back of this competition. So that's a very interesting game now.
When we look at how this debt is being financed, what new challenges and opportunities are arising? How could the emergence of stablecoins and other financial innovations change the landscape, for instance?
The way to finance all this debt is interesting because, as the IMF mentioned it, many countries now are using public debt to fund their economy. And we know that savers will help this and will fund this public debt. But it's complicated. If everyone has a higher debt, it's complicated. So we can imagine that central bank will be able to make a new quantitative easing period. But we have to imagine that this is not sustainable in the long run. It could be destabilizing in the long term because we are not in face of a specific shock as we had during the pandemic, for example. In that environment, the US has an advantage with the stablecoin. What is stablecoin? It's a situation where a company, a bank or a company, can purchase public debt and issue stablecoins with a value of $1. And the target for that, and that's what Scott Bessent, the Secretary of the Treasury in the US said, we will have an increase in our public debt and we will be able to diffuse these stablecoins all over the world. It's an advantage for the US, which will be able to fund its public debt in that way. That's what it is important because, the Congressional Budget Office said the public debt held by the public is 100% in 2025. It will be more than 150% in 2050. So Americans, U.S. institutions will purchase part of this new public debt, but the idea of the U.S. Treasury is that everyone in the world, from Japan to France to Brazil or Argentina, will be able to purchase this debt through stablecoins. That's a real question because China has decided not to go in this type of financing. And probably they are right to do that because it's probably a source of destabilizing the global economy. As we saw 20 years ago with all this product made in the US that was disseminated all around the world, which led to the Great Recession. And so it's a very tough question now. What will happen with this new type of financing, which is probably destabilizing in the long run for the world economy?
To wrap up, what strategic adjustments should we consider in our economic and social models to stabilize public debt in the long term? What key messages should we communicate to decision makers and investors in this context?
Well, the main issue is that many countries will issue public debt, but the risk will not be the same for every country. So investors will have to make trade-off between these risks. That's the first point, which means that we could have a brutal adjustment in different countries. The IMF said in that environment, we have to adjust our expenditures now. Clearly, what has driven public debt in the past is the fact that expenditures has grown a lot. Government said we are able to feed growth with our change trajectory of expenditures. And we have to do it now to avoid a brutal adjustment in the future. For Europe, the question is more specific in the fact that we have low growth and a trend of debt that is growing. And so we have high interest rates, but low growth. That's what drives the snowball effect on debt. We have high interest rates that feed debt, but low growth that do not feed receipt as expected. So what we have to do in Europe is to curb expenditures, clearly, and that's specific for France, for example, and at the same time, we have to spend a lot on innovation to improve productivity. That's what we have to do. And investors will perceive this situation with clarity. If we are not able to curb the expenditures and invest in innovation, probably we will have higher interest rates and an unsustainable situation. That's the worst way to do. That's something we have to avoid, and that's clearly the message economists have. Invest now, innovate now to avoid an unstable situation in the future.
Thank you, Philippe.
Thank you, Clément.
And see you soon for new insights from Waechter Asset Management.